Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. A few housekeeping things before we get started. We'll try to get to any questions that you may have at the end of the presentation. If you do have a question, please type it into the question area within the GoToWebinar navigation, and we'll get to as many as we can in our allotted time. If you'd like to join the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter, we encourage you to do so and use the hashtag ACSMwebinar. One continuing education credit, or CEC, will be emailed to all participants on the live version, and a link to the recorded version of today's webinar will also be emailed to you afterwards. You should receive that CEC email and a link within the next 1 to 2 days. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our ACSM moderator, Dr. Lynn Ciadella Cam, Assistant Professor at Case Western University. Dr. Cam?
Thank you, Nathan. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lynn Ciadella Cam, and on behalf of the American College of Sports Medicine, I want to welcome you to this webinar titled Carbohydrates, Performance and Weight Loss. Is low the way to go or the way to bonk? Our co-sponsors today, the ACSM and Wheat Food Council, have a strong relationship that is built on providing the best and most useful information to individuals participating in nutrition, exercise, and training programs. The ACSM is the largest sports medicine and exercise science organization in the world. With more than 50,000 members and certified professionals worldwide, ACSM is dedicated to advancing and integrating scientific research to provide educational and practical applications of exercise science and sports medicine. The Wheat Food Council is dedicated to increasing domestic wheat foods consumption through nutrition information, research, education, and promotional programs. Under the expert guidance of a scientific advisory board, the Wheat Food Council seeks to increase awareness of the nutritional contributions and benefits of wheat and foods made from wheat to an overall healthful eating pattern. Today's webinar presenter is Dr. Glenn Gazer. Dr. Gazer is a professor of exercise and wellness in the School of Nutrition and Health Promotion and is director of the Healthy Lifestyles Research Center at Arizona State University. Professor Gazer has had prior academic appointments at the University of Virginia and UCLA. He is also a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine. Dr. Gazer's research focuses on the effect of exercise and diet on cardiovascular fitness and health, and his work has been published in scientific journals, trade publications, newsletter, and internet sites. It is with great pleasure that I present to you Dr. Glenn Gazer.
Thank you, Kim. Lynn, the webinar should be a lot of fun. I think I have a lot of interesting information that we're going to go over. One thing before we start, you'll see below my name my email address. So if any of you have questions that are unable to be answered today, please feel free to email me, and I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. I see there are almost 1,700 of you out there. So if all of you email me with questions, be prepared for some degree of delay. The other thing I want to note is that a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation will be available to people if you would like one. So the disclosure I need to make is that I am a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Wheat Foods Council, which is sponsoring this presentation. So there are some learning objectives here, 3 of which include obtaining some information so you will be able to either advise clients or use this information yourself on the optimal amount of carbohydrates to recommend for performance or weight loss. Also specifically focusing on why or why not a low-carb approach is appropriate for athletes or others. And I will discuss some of the research on carbohydrate metabolism, health, weight, and chronic disease, and its impact on public health recommendations for carbohydrate. Most of this will be focused for the athlete. So a very pertinent question is a low-carb diet better for weight loss? Well, there have been a lot of diet books out there over the years. I've read a lot of them, and it has added to a considerable amount of confusion with regard to public health messages. So first of all, you have to understand that energy imbalance is necessary for any weight loss. You need to expend more calories than you consume. And particularly for fat loss, you need to consume less fat than you actually expend in order to lose body fat. So you look at that teeter-totter on the left-hand side, you can see that whether you are in weight maintenance or you gain weight or lose weight, it's largely dependent upon that difference between what you consume and what you expend. There's a lot of strategies for fat loss. For example, you can cut back on fat, go on a low-fat diet, and then you don't even have to burn much fat. On the other hand, you could go on a low-carb diet. Fat intake might be a little bit higher, and you can burn more fat that way because your body will adapt to that. So there are different strategies, and you can throw in exercise as well. And exercise burns a lot of fat during particularly prolonged exercise, and that can create a negative balance as well. So let's take a look at some of the evidence out there. First of all, if you look at this slide, it shows the results of a number of studies that were published over the last 20 to 30 years that I reviewed for an article I published 10 years ago in a scientific journal, in which I looked at the relationship between carbohydrate intake and body mass index. And all these cohort studies on the right-hand side that the pointer is going over, this represents about 200,000 to 300,000 men and women that were studied over varying periods of time. You can see that as a function of the carbohydrate intake, ranging from a low of around 25 to 30%, all the way up to nearly 65% or more, the relationship with body mass index is inverse. It's actually negative, which means that higher carbohydrate intake is associated with a relatively lower body mass index. If you do the numbers on this, you find that the body weight difference between high and low carbohydrate intake groups is typically about 5 to 7 pounds. So these data kind of suggest that overall, in various populations of men and women, the carbohydrate intake tends to vary inversely with the body weight. Now, if you take a look at specific studies that have been comparing carb and other macronutrient combinations head-to-head, here's a study that was published a few years ago in JAMA, one of the leading medical journals, that compared weight loss among named diet programs in overweight and obese adults. And you look at the conclusion there, and it basically suggests that significant weight loss was observed with any low-carb or low-fat approach, as long as the calories were less than those calories consumed were less than those that were burned. So the practice of recommending any diet that a patient will adhere to is the clear recommendation here. And here are some of the results of that. This may appear like it's a complicated slide. Let me kind of walk you through this. If you take a look, first of all, at my cursor going from no diet to the Learn program, moderate, then low carb, and low fat, these are diets that were compared head-to-head with one another or with a no diet intervention for either 6 months, which my cursor is going over on the left-hand side, to 12 months along the top here. So what I want to focus on is this comparison of either low carb, where my cursor is over now, to low fat. And at 12 months, this red circle indicates that there is only a 0.02 kilogram difference between low carb and low fat after 12 months of follow-up, which means that essentially the low carb and low fat approaches, it was a toss-up. Both of them resulted in equal amounts of weight loss, and both were superior to no diet treatment itself. There was another meta-analysis published that same year that looked at low-carb and isoenergetic balanced diets for reducing weight and cardiovascular risk. And again, in the short term, low-carb or a balanced approach was basically equally effective. And their conclusion that bullet point 2 here, that my cursor is over, there's probably little or no difference in weight loss and changes in cardiovascular risk factors for up to 2 years of follow-up. And this is even in individuals with or without type 2 diabetes. All right, so how do they know that? Well, this slide here is what they refer to as a forest plot. And if you look at my cursor here that has is over this vertical line here, this is comparing diets head-to-head. These are on the left-hand side. The first author of the articles are over here. This is for low-carb diets that happen to be relatively high in fat. Down here, this is low-carb diets that are relatively high in protein. And so they compare them head-to-head with a balanced diet. And so any point you see out here, either the green points or the dark diamonds here, anything to the left of that line, it would favor the low-carb. Anything to the right of that line, it would favor a balanced approach. And you can see overall, most of the points fall very close to this line, which means there's not much of a difference between the two dietary approaches, whether the low-carb diet is relatively high in fat or relatively high in carb. In fact, after 1 to 2 years, the net difference was only about a pound. And I don't think anyone would be that excited about a net difference of a pound after 1 to 2 years. All right? So just a few comments about diet and health, that's irrespective of whether you lose weight on the diet. It has generally been found that low-fat diets that are high in fiber-rich foods tend to be associated with higher overall diet quality. This is fairly clear-cut and established in the literature. And particularly with regard to whole grain consumption, that is associated with lower risk of a lot of chronic diseases, including type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. And for your reference, I cite 4 meta-analyses that were published in major medical or scientific journals, all in the last year, that support this contention about the benefits of whole grains in health. But let's shift gears and talk about performance. Is carbohydrate necessary? Well, you can hit the wall. This is a term that was coined probably about 40 years ago, and it referred to individuals that seem to just run out of gas or bonk sometime during the race. And if you're wondering, that is not me laying there with my head on the curb or the head on the curb there, although I have had numerous experiences during my athletic endeavors where I have felt very much like that individual. Most people have about 2 hours worth of glycogen that they can use when racing. Once these stores are depleted or severely reduced, you have some problems. And so this can be a problem for anyone wanting to exercise for an extended period of time. So before we move on, just a little bit of review on energy production 101, and if you're not biochemically oriented, let me go through this kind of quickly. The bottom line is whether you burn carb or whether you burn fat, that energy all basically funnels down through one final common pathway known as the Krebs cycle, and you get energy in the form of ATP in different places. The point is that fats and carbohydrates both feed into this system via acetyl coenzyme A, and I have a double arrow over here to indicate that carbohydrates enter that pathway much faster than fat. How do we know this? Well, if you take a look at the maximum rates of energy production from carbohydrates and fats, you see this. So for example, on the left-hand side here, you get kcals per minute in terms of the energy production. And if my cursor's over this bar on the far left-hand side, that indicates that the maximum kcals per minute in trained and untrained adults using fat as a fuel is only about 6 calories per minute. Now, if you take individuals that are fairly well trained and put them on a low-carb diet for several weeks or months, you can actually increase that quite a bit to maybe about 13 to 15 calories a minute. But when you compare that to the maximum energy production from carbohydrates, there is no comparison. Carbs dominate as a fuel. So well-trained athletes can basically derive maybe about 25 to 30 calories, sometimes even more, per minute from carbohydrates. There is no condition for which fat will ever be able to beat carbohydrate as a fuel when you're talking about maximum rates. One of the reasons why carbohydrate is so important is because muscle glycogen, which is fairly short in supply in the body. You typically only have maybe about 1,500 to 2,000 calories worth of muscle glycogen. And you can see on this slide here, the rate of muscle glycogen utilization on the left-hand side is a function of the percentage of VO2 max, which is basically relative exercise intensity. There's a curvilinear relationship. So at fairly low intensities, you get very little muscle glycogen degradation. But at higher intensities, you get significantly increased rates of glycogen degradation. So this is really important for sudden increases in pace that may occur in races, the sprint at the end of the race, and for sustaining that effort for many minutes, if not hours. And if you're wondering about other types of activities such as soccer, football, lacrosse, basketball, other team sports that are not steady state, muscle glycogen is very, very important. So these data come from this 1970 study in Sweden. Shows that muscle biopsy data on individuals that competed in a soccer match showed before the match glycogen levels are pretty high. By halftime, they're less than half of what they were. And after the match, they're virtually depleted. And this little arrow showing exhaustion here is based upon studies indicating that when you get down to this range right about here, so about 25% of maybe the initial level, you start to run into problems with sustaining high levels of energy expenditure. And actually, there was a wonderful study published about that time that glycogen loaded one team and glycogen depleted another team, and looked at motion pictures of the amount of time they spent standing, walking, jogging, and sprinting in the match. And those that were loaded with carbohydrates spent a great deal more time at higher intensities and higher rates of speed during the match, particularly in the second half. So even in team sports that require a lot of stop-and-go activity, it's important. And diet can affect the initial muscle glycogen levels. So in this slide here, you see initial muscle glycogen levels here. And as they go up, you can see time to exhaustion is increased. Well, the interesting thing is on a high-fat diet, you don't have much glycogen and you don't last very long. On a high-carbohydrate diet, you get more muscle glycogen, you'll last a lot longer. And that is compared to a normal diet that has a level of glycogen that's midway between the low and the high. So this clearly shows that the greater the amount of muscle glycogen, the longer the time to exhaustion when exercising. Key advantage for carbs. And this is important on a day-to-day basis. So in this slide here, you see some data published by one of the world's best exercise physiologists ever, Dave Costill, formerly at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, had individuals who were fairly well trained do 3 consecutive very high-intensity exercise bouts here, here, and here, one day apart, and either supply them with a low-carb diet or a high-carb diet. And you can see that glycogen levels fall during exercise, but the high-carb diet replenished them, not all the way, but mostly. The low-carb diet had no such effect. Exercise depleted again on the second day. The high-carb diet was able to replenish a lot of the carbohydrate loss during exercise, not so with the low-carb. And then finally, for the third day, you get a repeat. So after 3 consecutive days, and this wasn't exhaustive training, it was just good hard workouts that lasted about an hour, you can see there's a marked difference in the amount of glycogen left in the muscles of these individuals. Now you can only imagine what would happen on day 4 or 5 or 6 or onwards on this low-carb diet. So I want to introduce this concept of a fat-burning zone. And I do want to emphasize that race intensities for most endurance efforts are well above the so-called fat-burning zone, which you can see here generally ranges between about 55% of VO2 max and about 70 to 75% of VO2 max. This range here is noted as the fat-burning zone. Another point to make here is that when you get to very high intensities, close to VO2 max or at VO2 max, fat becomes really irrelevant as a fuel source. And there are a lot of sports that require intensities, efforts that are out close to VO2 max. And this slide here kind of just depicts what happens when you move from low to moderate to higher intensities of exercise. The contribution of fat, which starts out maybe 80 to 90% on a person's diet that might be just mixed or a little bit on the low-carb side, by the time you get out to very high intensities, it falls to nearly zero, whereas the carbohydrate contribution goes from a low level to a very high level. And I should point out that most competitive endurance events are in this region out here that I'm circling around high intensity, which clearly means that carbohydrates are going to be the dominant fuel. So to just summarize a little bit so far, the preferred fuel for high-intensity exercise is carbohydrate. It's much faster than fat, which is a relatively slow fuel. It allows for greater endurance at high-intensity exercise, and you can replace muscle glycogen stores much faster, which means you get faster recovery. So what is all this stuff about low-carb intake and exercise, which seems to be somewhat more popular, at least now, than it was 5 or 10 years ago, certainly 20 or 30 or 40 years ago? What's the rationale? Does it work? Well, the origins of this low-carb strategy come from a number of different sources. One is anecdotal testimonials of people who have tried this. Another is the popularity of Paleo diet over the last 10 years or so, and other variants of the Paleo diet. Some recent scientific evidence I'll explore, and also what we call this classic study of Finney et al. That was published more than 30 years ago. And that is a very critical study, this Finney study in 1983, and it's worth looking at to find out exactly what they did and what they found. So this was basically a study on 5 well-trained male cyclists who consumed a ketogenic diet that's very low carb for 4 weeks. The author's conclusion was, and I quote, "These results indicate that aerobic endurance exercise by well-trained cyclists not compromised by 4 weeks of ketosis." So what did they do? They had them do an exercise bout at about 62 to 64% of VO2 max. Now that's a fairly moderate intensity, certainly for these well-trained athletes. This is before and after 4 weeks on this low-carb ketogenic diet. And they were told to exercise at this intensity until they could go no longer. And you can see before, they lasted about 2.5 hours, 150 minutes. After the ketogenic diet, about the same. They were right around 150 minutes. But let's look at the individual data. And they did present this in the paper. So here are the 5 subjects, the individual data. They're listed over here in color. And you can see some interesting findings here. For example, one subject, this one here, subject 1, clearly benefited by the ketogenic diet, no question. Subject 3 also benefited by the ketogenic diet, got better. So the endurance time was longer. Subject 5, this guy right here, looks like no effect whatsoever. On the other hand, 2 subjects here, the one in purple, subject 4, and the one in red, subject 2, both appeared to get worse by about almost an hour or so on the ketogenic diet. So you have an unusual result here where you got, yes, 2 subjects got better, but 2 subjects got worse, and 1 subject performed the same. Now, interestingly enough, I looked at the data that the authors provided, and the 2 subjects that got worse actually increased their fat oxidation the most on the ketogenic diet, which basically completely undermines the conclusions of the authors that ketogenic diet enhances fat oxidation. This should help endurance. It did not, because the 2 subjects that increased fat oxidation the most actually got worse. And actually, over the last 30 some odd years, this is the most frequently studied or cited study as an endorsement for the ketogenic diet. So, a couple more points. Few contests are actually contested at about 63% of VO2 max. This is a fairly moderate intensity for elite individuals. And finally, there's no published evidence that a low-carb diet will improve endurance at high exercise intensities, which are more race competitive. So, after all that time, you'd think that someone would try to repeat that, or at least try to extend that study. And it was done this last year in 2016. There was a study published by a group of individuals, and you'll notice the last author here, Stephen Finney, is also an author on this paper. This one had the format of taking 20 elite ultra marathoners and Ironman distance triathletes that were doing very well at a lot of these major competitions. So these are very, very experienced ultramarathoners and triathletes. 10 of them habitually consumed a high-carb diet. 10 habitually consumed a low-carb diet. And you can see the differences here, about 59% carb versus about 10% carb. Comparable protein intake, but markedly different fat intake. So clearly we have two groups of individuals that are fairly comparable in their endurance performance capabilities, but differ markedly in their habitual diets. They did some max and submaximal testing, and I'll focus just on one of the outcomes here. But before we do so, remember, this fat burning zone here ranges from about 55 to 70 to 75% of your VO2 max. So their exercise intensity that they chose here for the submax testing was very close to right about where this arrow is pointing here, which is at peak fat oxidation. So this is what they found during the maximal testing, that you look at panel A here, this is the peak fat oxidation rate in grams per minute amongst those that were on the high-carb diet and the low-carb diet. And not unexpectedly, you find the low-carb individuals burn considerably more fat during this exercise bout than did the individuals on the high-carb diet. And it occurred at about 55% of VO2 max for the high-carb group and close to 70 on average for the low-carb group, which would put them, the high-carb group would be right about here, the low-carb group out here. Theoretically, you should expect an advantage to the low-carb group. But they did a 3-hour exercise bout, and this was not to exhaustion. It was basically 3 hours at, they say 65%, is actually about 64% of VO2 max. They had a shake that was either a high in carb or low in carb about an hour and a half before the run. And then they did a treadmill run for 3 hours and then some recovery. So they made some measurements during this period of time so they could look at the differences between the athletes, and this is what they found. So in the top panel that the cursor's over now, this is fat oxidation in grams per minute, carbohydrate oxidation in grams per minute. And this is during the treadmill run from my cursor here. This is 3 hours of treadmill running. And you can see quite clearly that the high-carb group burned considerably less fat throughout the entire 3 hours than did the low-carb group. And the flip was seen for the carbohydrate oxidation. The high-carb group was up here, burning much more carb, and the low-carb group, much less carb. So basically, this just shows that habitual low-carb consumers burned more fat and less carbohydrate during a 3-hour run at about 64% of VO2 max. Now, the author's conclusion was basically, they said this is the first documentation of metabolic adaptations associated with, and I emphasize here, long-term consumption of a very low-carb, high-fat diet in highly trained, keto-adapted ultra-endurance athletes. The major caveats here are that performance was not assessed, and prolonged submaximal exercise test was at 64% of VO2 max, which is not really race competitive for anything marathon or shorter. So, how do we reconcile this? Well, there was a study published just last December. It was EPUB'd online December 23rd, so it's only been out for about not even 2 months now. And this was done by an Australian group that took very highly trained male race walkers at the Australia Institute of Sport. They underwent 3 weeks of intensified training along with one of 3 dietary interventions, one of which was a high-carb availability, one of which was a periodized approach of high-carb availability, and one was a low-carb, high-fat. And you can see underneath that the high-carb was about 60 to 65% carb versus the low-carb, which is about 75 to 80% fat and less than 50 grams a day of carbs. So this is truly a low-carb diet here. The difference between the high-carb availability and the periodized was basically that the high-carb availability all the time was basically they had carb all day long at all their meals and snacks. The periodized approach was that they spread out differently between and within days that sometimes have low carb availability during some training sessions, high carb during others, but overall they consume the same amount of carbohydrate. The most important thing to note here is that they had physiological and performance testing. So, general results of this. Total energy and protein intake was the same across all dietary conditions. That's key. Training volume was similar, so all groups trained the same, except for the low-carb group seemed to have a little bit higher perception of effort and had some difficulty completing the training sessions. Also, VO2 peak increased in all groups. The low-carb, high-fat group increased fat oxidation during exercise, just like the other studies have shown. However, they did not improve performance despite an increase in VO2 peak. The race walking performance, final bullet, was improved in both of the high carbs groups. So how do we know this? They had all the race walkers perform a IAAF sanctioned 10-kilometer race. This is a walking race in these race walkers, and you can see here the high carb groups, both of them, whether it's just all throughout the training or periodized approach. They improved their time by about 190 seconds on average, so a little over 3 minutes, a little over 2 minutes for this group, shown here, the significant drop in time. The low-carb, high-fat group, they actually got a little bit slower, not statistically significantly so, but clearly you have a situation here where the low-carb group improved their ability to burn fat, but it did not translate to improved performance. Whereas the high-carb groups, the improved training along with the high-carb group had the effect of improving performance. Advantage carb. All right? And this is basically the take-home message here, and I've underlined the important thing, that the adaptation to this low-fat or low-carb, high-fat diet actually impaired performance in the elite endurance athletes despite a significant improvement in peak aerobic capacity that went along with the training. So what about this high-carb approach? Does it work? Well, you can look up online and find sources that will provide you with the top marathon performances of all time. And I did this recently, and the result is that 95 of the top 100 marathon performances ever recorded are by Kenyans and Ethiopians. No surprise here. If anyone follows the marathon world, you notice they win just about everything. So what do their diets look like? Well, there are a couple published studies that have addressed this issue and looked at the diets of the Kenyans and Ethiopians. And here I've shown you a couple reports that indicate that Kenyans and Ethiopians have a fairly high intake of carbohydrate, about 64 to 76%, fairly low intake of fat, and actually a fairly low intake of protein, and this does not appear to be hurting them any in terms of their performance. So, what about a modified approach? Would it be possible to take some of the advantages of a low-carb approach to basically increase our fat-burning potential, but also mix that in with a normal high-carb dietary practice that might be used to enhance performance? Can we have a kind of the best of both worlds, if you will? Well, there is a training philosophy called train low, race high. And the science behind this basically suggests it's limited, first of all, to a handful of short-term studies that typically have the following design. You take two groups of athletes and they randomize them to two training conditions. Both receive actually the same daily total carbohydrate intake. However, one group, which is typically referred to as the train high, they only get one training session per day. So they're always training under fairly high carb conditions. The train low typically has been achieved by having two training sessions per day, but alternating days. So they get the same total amount of training. They just do it in fewer days. They alternate days. And the interesting thing is that after the first training session on one of those days, they get no carbohydrate repletion between the training sessions on the same day. So the second training session is actually performed under low-carb conditions. So this is a nice design because it's, each subject kind of serves as their own control here. And then basically you look at this train low, race high result. What do the studies show? Well, the studies generally show that you get better skeletal muscle adaptations under train low conditions. So this seems to suggest there's some merit in having at least some of your training sessions that are fairly low in carbohydrate availability. Flip side, there is a higher exercise tolerance and greater work performed under the train high condition. So this means that you have to have some of your training sessions typically when carbohydrate availability is high. Most importantly, though, every one of these studies that's been published shows there is no difference at all, in terms of performance measures, which means that this remains, this train low, race high philosophy or paradigm is just that. It's a hypothesis, but it has not proven to be any better than just continual high carbohydrate dietary practices. So some of the pitfalls with trying this training low are indicated on this slide. So for example, several studies show that chronic low-carb diet may compromise the ability to maintain desired training intensity. Also, high amounts of exercise performed in a low-carb state may actually increase susceptibility to illness and infection. So carbs play a very important role in offsetting exercise-induced immunosuppression. So performing a lot of exercise in a low-carb state, particularly when the intensity is high, is a gamble here, that you may be increasing your risk for some sort of infection or illness. Another important point to make is that exercising under conditions of low carbohydrate availability may actually increase protein breakdown. So this is not good because this could impair the maintenance of muscle mass, and this is the last thing any athlete would want to have is an increase in protein breakdown. So you have to be very careful here in choosing whether or not you want to adopt this training low philosophy. And another point is that exercising while limiting carbohydrate intake may actually impair the capacity to utilize carbohydrate optimally when consumed during competition. So again, this suggests that you need to have some training practices where you have carbohydrate availability both before and during the training session that kind of mimics what you might expect during a race. So again, you have some issues here with carbohydrate intake. High carb days tend to be associated with basically a better outlook on life compared to the no carb days that could make one a little bit difficult to get along with. All right, so there are some practical applications here. So you might be able to get the best of both training philosophies, the train low and the race high here by training in a fasted state. So for example, you could have a morning exercise before eating. So your carbohydrate availability would certainly be lower in the morning in a fasted state than it would be in the afternoon or after breakfast or any other time after you've had some meal that contains carbohydrate. And similar to the study I just mentioned, you could have 2 training sessions here per day with no carb replenishment after the first session. So with that in mind, it might be wise to make sure you're training low workouts, not be all that intense. You might also consider caffeine ingestion or a carbohydrate mouthwash or a rinse on the train low days. There are some examples here for studies in the literature particularly show that frequent contact of carbohydrate with the mouth and oral cavity can stimulate parts of the brain and central nervous system that can enhance perceptions of well-being. So even if you don't drink the carbohydrate, just the carbohydrate mouth rinse may be able to get you through the workout a little bit better. Another strategy might be to ingest some protein, perhaps 20 to 25 grams ingested maybe before, during, and or after the train low session, just to make sure you're not compromising protein balance and skeletal muscle. And then finally, training programs should include sessions of training high that stimulate competition fueling schedule just to make sure your body is adjusted to the intensity and fueling needs that you're going to encounter during the actual race. So why does this train low, race high concept persist? This avoidance of carbohydrates as if there's something evil. Well, there are a lot of books that have been out there over the years. I've listed a few on the screen here: Paleo Diet, Primal Blueprint, Zone, and so forth, that have all had some fairly derogatory comments about carbohydrates, and I think unjustifiably so. But I should point out there may be some pitfalls of including too much protein in a diet, which may be consistent with a paleo diet. And the reason I say that is because there are a number of studies published in the last 35 years that have shown that high protein intake may actually impair the capacity for high intensity exercise. And you might ask, well, how could protein impair the capacity for very high intensity exercise? Well, let me give you an example of just one study. This is probably one of the best that's been published. There have been a number of studies before and since then. If you note the date, it's 1987. But you can search the literature and find studies before and after that that pretty much confirm their findings. These researchers had 11 healthy men perform exercise to exhaustion under 3 dietary conditions. And you can see here there was a control condition that had a kind of a moderate amount of carb, moderate amount of fat, and a moderate amount of protein. This is not too far different from the typical American diet. Then you had a low carb and a high carb. And the fundamental difference here is strikingly different carb intake, different fat intake, and different protein intake. So this low-carb diet might be analogous to some of the low-carb paleo-type diets that are out there right now that are low in carb and relatively high in fat. This wouldn't be extraordinarily high in protein, but it's certainly well above that of the high carb. So let's see what happens here. Well, first of all, they took blood samples and determined their acid-base status. And you can see here that the diets had markedly different effects upon the relative degree of acidity or baseness of their blood levels. So the low-carb diet had a acidifying effect on the blood, whereas the high-carb diet a relatively alkalizing effect on the blood. And this is important because this kind of reflects buffering capacity. So to see whether or not it affected performance, they actually had them exercise on 3 different times under the different dietary conditions at 100% of VO2 max. Now, 100% of VO2 max typically is associated with exercise times in around the 3 to maybe 6-7 minute range, somewhere in that time frame. And you can see what happens here on the control diet. They were able to go for about 308 seconds, so a little over 5 minutes. That was significantly reduced to just under 4 minutes on the low-carb diet and improved on the high-carb diet. So this difference here of 56% greater endurance on the high-carb diet was totally due to the fact that they were able to buffer better. So what happens here is that when you have high protein intake, in this case perhaps greater than about 2 grams per kilogram body weight per day, which well exceeds that recommended. So for example, the RDA is about 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight per day. For endurance athletes, it might be recommended that you get closer to somewhere around maybe 1.2, 1.3 grams per kilogram per day. This is well in excess of that. And the adverse effects of protein intakes is likely due to the increased acid load that reduces buffering capacity. In fact, blood bicarbonate levels were about 11% lower on the low-carb diet compared to the high-carb diet. And this severely limits the ability to tolerate high-intensity exercise associated with lactate production. So there are some guidelines for fueling before, during, and after exercise that I would like to leave you with. And this was published just last year. It was a joint effort between the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the Dietitians of Canada, and the American College of Sports Medicine. And this was on nutrition and athletic performance. Here's the publication. It's been out just about a year now. And I'm going to go through this, and I do want to make sure that you understand these are recommendations, and just that. So individual results may vary, and it is recommended that you try these, and you may have to adjust as necessary. So first of all, daily needs for fuel and recovery. The light, moderate, and very high intensities would be classified as, for example, low intensity or skill-based activities, moderate exercise of about an hour a day, an endurance program of 1 to 3 hours a day of moderate to vigorous, and this would be extreme commitment. These are individuals that train 4 to 5 hours a day of moderate to vigorous intensity activity, and you can see the carbohydrate intake here ranges from around 3 to 5 grams per kilogram body weight per day all the way to 8 to 12. Now, if you actually work out the numbers here for an average, let's say, 150-pound person, this could range anywhere from around maybe 600-700 calories a day to over 3,000 calories a day. And you might say, wow, isn't that a lot of carbohydrate? Well, consider someone training 4 to 5 hours a day. They might burn 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day, which means that this recommendation might be consistent with the amount of carbohydrate they would actually need. So again, individual results may vary. This is what is recommended. So for acute fueling strategies, these are for activities basically that last anywhere from less than 90 minutes, more than 90 minutes, or for speedy refueling in which you have activities that are contested within an 8-hour period. So you might have two fuel-demanding sessions that are less than 8 hours apart. So for example, something in the morning, something later in the afternoon, or early in the evening. And so what I want to point out here is that for activities less than 90 minutes, somewhere around 7 to 12 kilograms or grams per kilogram body weight every 24 hours as for daily needs. For activities longer than 90 minutes, maybe about 10 to 12 grams per kg for every 24 hours, starting about a day and a half to 2 days before. And then for speedy recovery, about 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram per hour for the first 4 hours, and then just resume whatever your daily needs are. And again, for pre-event fueling and during brief exercise or during sustained high-intensity exercise, for any exercise lasting more than 60 minutes, about 1 to 4 grams per kg body weight consumed about 1 to 4 hours before exercise. Anything less than 45 minutes is really not necessary. And if you're going about 45 minutes to 75 minutes, small amounts of carbohydrate is necessary, including possibly a carbohydrate mouth rinse. And if you're actually during the event, now we don't have to worry about body weight because the absorption of glucose is independent of your body weight. Anything lasting about 1 to 2.5 hours, maybe about 30 to 60 grams per hour. If you're doing some kind of ultra endurance, 2.5 to 3 hours or even more, maybe up to about 90 grams per hour would be sufficient. And if it looks like I went through that quickly, sorry, but these can be obtained from this source here, as well as the PDF of this presentation. If anyone wants it, you will be provided a copy of the PDF for your own edification. So just a few summary points before we can get to some Q&A. For weight loss, the evidence shows quite clearly low-carb diets are no more effective than low-fat diets or balanced diets. It really is the calories and not the carbs. For endurance performance, it's clear that carbohydrate is a much faster fuel than fat. It breaks down faster. It provides more energy in a given amount of time. It is the fuel of choice for high-intensity exercise. Carbohydrates provide more energy, or ATP, per liter of oxygen consumed, which is typically the limiting factor in exercise. And most importantly for our discussion today, the maximum rate of energy production is about 3 to 5 times higher for carb compared to fat. Initial muscle glycogen levels are very important for endurance sports lasting more than about an hour and a half. There is no evidence to show that low-carb diet will improve competitive endurance performance by more than a moderate to high-carb diet. So the evidence is still pretty clear that the moderate to high-carb diet is the diet of choice. Low-carb diets may impair an athlete's capacity performing and completing high-intensity workouts. So there are a lot of caveats associated with this training low paradigm. And high protein content of some low-carb diets may actually reduce tolerance for high-intensity exercise. And this is very important to consider if you are someone who likes to consume a lot of protein. And then finally, the train low, race high method. Skeletal muscle adaptations are enhanced, but endurance has not been shown to be improved. Even with a train low, race high paradigm, there is a need for adequate carbohydrate. And finally, I'll leave you with this before we close here. The world's best marathoners do consume fairly high carbohydrate diets, typically in excess of 60% carbohydrates. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you. And Lynn, I'm ready for questions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gazer. So we do have a few questions for you. The first question is, you presented information comparing low-fat versus low-carbohydrate diets in obese and overweight adults, showing no difference in effectiveness. Is this finding consistent with guidelines for weight loss in athletes?
Yeah, pretty much so. There's no reason to believe that athletes would respond any differently. The advantage with athletes, though, is that because they exercise so much, they have a metabolic advantage, because what typically happens when you consume foods is that if you have your glycogen stores fairly well packed in your liver and muscle and you consume carbohydrates, they've got nowhere to go, and so you tend to stimulate oxidation of carbs under those conditions and you store fat. When you exercise a lot, you basically burn a lot of carb in your liver and skeletal muscle. That leaves a lot of room for carb in the diet to go right in to replace that, so you can actually burn some of your fat stores. So that's somewhat of an advantage for individuals who are regular exercisers. They may have much more metabolic flexibility in terms of what they can or cannot eat.
Great, thank you. And then another question we have is, does the type of carbohydrate in the diet matter? That is, can an athlete get the carbohydrates from a non-grain source and still consume adequate carbohydrates?
In terms of carbohydrate replenishment in the liver and muscle, absolutely. Even though I'm a strong advocate of grains, particularly whole grains, because of the health benefits, if someone needs carbohydrate quickly, they can consume pretty much anything. A bag of jelly beans will do it. So it doesn't matter if it's a simple sugar or a complex carbohydrate. For glycogen replenishment, the source of carbohydrate is not nearly as important as the fact that you're getting carbohydrates. For overall health, however, I would say whole grains might be a better choice than the jelly beans.
Great, thank you. And then one final question for you. You presented information on how high-protein diets is detrimental to high-intensity exercise performance. Is the impact on performance due to the actual high-protein intake of these diets, with around 2 grams per kilogram, or the low-carbohydrate intake comparison, the ketogenic diets?
It's probably a little of both. There's no question that the increased acidity can impair performance, and this is done even without looking at high carbohydrate diets. There are studies separately from that where infusions into the blood stream are made where it actually increases the acidity of the blood, not from protein sources in the diet, and performance is impaired. You can infuse sodium bicarbonate, which ups buffer capacity, and performance is enhanced. So it probably is in part related to the acidity associated with the protein. But also, it's been well documented that when you have a very low carbohydrate diet and low carbohydrate stores as a result, you may impair the capacity for high intensity exercise. But I think it's probably more related to the protein than the low carb nature of the diet.
Okay, great, thank you. So thank you, Dr. Gazer, for that great presentation. On behalf of ACSM and the Wheat Foods Council, thank you for attending today's webinar. I will now turn it back over to Nate from ACSM for some final housekeeping announcements.
Great, thanks guys, and for all those that submitted questions, we appreciate it. We'll do our best to share those questions with Dr. Gazer and have him turn them into a blog that we'll post on our certification website, and we'll also promote through our social media channels, so be on the lookout for that. And as a final reminder, an email with a link to your CEC along with a PDF copy of today's slides and a recorded version of the webinar will be sent to you via email here in the next 1 to 2 days. Also within that email, there will be a link to a survey, and we do appreciate your feedback. And with that, I'd like to wish everybody a great afternoon.
Nate?
Yeah.
Nate, could I make one more quick comment?
Go for it.
Yeah, I've been asked this question a number of times about ultra endurance. I mean the really, really long-term endurance events that last like days sometimes. And the only thing I want to mention there is that individual results here vary tremendously. For example, last year, a guy by the name of Carl Meltzer set an Appalachian Trail record, and he beat the former record by several hours, I think. And the diet of this guy is phenomenal. It's basically fueled by beer and candy. He just basically survived for the 2,190 miles during this Appalachian Trail race that took 45 days on Red Bull, Tang, beer, Three Musketeers bar, bacon, and Spree candy, which is almost all sugar. The record he broke, the guy who did it before him, did the run, the whole Appalachian Trail run on a vegan diet. So go figure, we have two markedly different approaches, and yet we have two elite level athletes here. So when you get out into those categories, I think a lot of the recommendations we would like to get out there have to be cautioned, because individuals basically have their own personal tastes for food.
Great. Well, we appreciate that. Again, thanks to everyone for attending. Look out for that email and have a great afternoon.